Welcome everyone to this edition of the 2021 Maryland State Firemen's Association's virtual convention and conference. I'm your facilitator, Christopher Naum. Our session here today is Reading the Building, Residential and Commercial Size Up and Facts, First Arriving, Construction, Tactics, and Safety. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Christopher Naum. I'm the Chief of Training of the Commanders Institute. 40-plus year fire service veteran, been involved in the fire service in a variety of capacities, both as a fire officer, fire instructor, former architect, former fire protection engineer. Currently serve as a technical advisor and subject matter expert to the NIOSH Firefighter Line of Duty Death Investigation Program. I've been doing so for the last 13 years. I've been involved in a variety of different capacities. As an instructor at the National Fire Academy, been actively engaged in a variety of different venues and activities nationally. I've been a National Fire Service instructor for 35 years and also instruct and lecture on a global basis. For those of you that have followed my writings over the last 30 plus years, or over the last 20 years in particular, certainly, again, may be very much familiar with my focal point on building construction, operational issues affecting firefighter safety, operational effectiveness, and command decision-making. Some of the information we are presenting here today is still available online. I wrote for Firehouse Magazine for well over 25 years. We ran a column called the Buildings on Fire series on Firehouse, as well as some individual articles and columns that appeared over that 20-plus year period. Some of that information is currently still available within the firehouse.com archives. If you go online, do a quick search, you'll find some of that information dealing with the predictability of building performance and buildings on fire, talking about a number of different attributes. Again, some information is available online for your review and usage. Some other resources that you may have some interest in pursuing. Again, these are non-commercial in basis. We do run a couple of websites and some items on social media. Buildingsonfire.com, Buildings on Fire on Facebook, and Buildings on Fire on Twitter, which is our @Command Safety handle, and @Buildings on Fire. Both our social media footprint as well as our Instagram, again, focus in very specifically on building construction related issues, the anatomy of building construction, dealing with, again, building integrity, operational issues, size up, a lot of stuff on reading the building, of which our session here today is focusing in upon. I also would encourage you to take a look at our archived information on fireengineering.com on the Blog Talk Radio series. Go to fireengineering.com. You'll be able to find the link to the podcast. We do offer and publish on a monthly basis a number of pertinent programs, normally pretty involving, regarding informational items on building construction and the anatomy of building construction. A couple of which, again, are specific to our program here. We did a multiple part series talking about insights on commercial fires, construction, operations, and command. That was in 2020. We also ran a couple of series and a couple of podcasts on the insight of mega mansions and large area residentials. And then also in this year, in 2021, we did a program on a conversation on hybrid construction and fireground operational issues, specifically dealing with commercial hybrid structures. And again, I think you'll find all three of those particular focal points of interest. It's taking it to the streets. It's on the fireengineering.com Blog Talk Radio program. And again, I encourage you to take a look at the archives for not only these, but a number of other programs regarding building construction, operational issues affecting the fire service. Our 2021 virtual program here for the Maryland State Firemen's Association, again, is an abridged program and a lecture format from our normal 8, 12, or 16-hour face-to-face series. It's a general overview of key insights related to reading the building and building facts, and that's our acronym for First Arriving, Construction, Tactics, and Safeties, giving you some insights on size up considerations and a different modeling, different perspective on sizing up our buildings, more applicable to both the residential and commercial occupancies, although it's really applicable to any building type. But we're going to be focusing in on the small footprint commercial occupancy, and then also the residential from the single family, small footprint, talking a little bit about the large area residentials and mega mansions also. The program was edited for the virtual program timeframe. We'll hope to maintain that as we go through our program here today. It will be rather fluid, again, based upon the sizable amount of information that we are trying to present within a small confine of time frame. But at the same time, again, we will cover a number of different bases here that will at least give you some insights on a very broad level, drill back down to a very specific level, and then back up to the model perspective of some of the insights on size up. We certainly look forward to seeing everyone in person in 2022 as conditions continue to improve based upon our current national, state, and local level conditions. We're integrating in our program some items dealing with size up, risk, building construction, profiling, predictability. Much of what we talk about deals with the concept and the methodologies and the process that we've been promoting certainly since late 1999, early 2000s, talking about the predictability of building performance, how buildings truly are predictable if we understand what it is that we need to be looking at, and looking at those buildings and reading the buildings in a different point of context that has relevancy based upon building, based upon fire conditions, and then based upon local resource capabilities. We'll talk about some of the concepts on reading the building, the acronym of BEAR. We'll introduce some items dealing with modeling, operational tactical challenges, and again, some size up informational items. Although we don't have the ability to do a discussion as we normally would in a face-to-face type of program with much more engagement, and that allows for a better opportunity for gaining the insights, understanding some of the concepts, taking a look at the modeling, and then really getting into a level of engagement that a face-to-face type of presentation normally would offer. But nonetheless, the program will provide some high-level insights within these related areas as we go forward into the program. There are a number of resources that are available to you for those of you that do have an interest. Again, you can email me. I'll provide you with both another email address as well as a cell phone number on the concept of building facts, first arriving construction tactics and safety, some other operational aids on reading the building facts, a flow chart, some other items, again, for some consideration as you move forward. As I mentioned, feel free to contact me both by email or through my cell phone. I encourage you to reach out to me at any point in time in the future if you do have some needs. We do quite a bit online, both within our blogs, our websites, as well as our social media. We are typically presenting nationally and regionally throughout all of the major conferences and programs. So I do look forward to speaking with any of you in person or online or through other facilitated capabilities, whether it be Zoom, phone call, email, and such. So feel free to reach out to help support your particular growth, operational, professional development needs. When we take a look at operational issues, we take a look at some of the challenge relative to our occupancies, our occupancy risks, our occupancy types, the fire conditions that we typically may be encountering. They ultimately all go back to and are based upon building anatomy, construction, the features that go in there, our interface during an operational standpoint of our companies and our personnel, which are critical for the success and mitigation of any particular event and incident. They are all integrated, but yet many times we classify them and look at them in an individual standpoint, siloed out versus an integrated, homogeneous, holistic approach toward our operations. When we take a look at today's buildings and residents, both in terms of commercial occupancies, they do present increasing challenges that have redefined strategic and tactical fireground operations and have changed the rules of engagement in structural fire incidences. And again, when we talk about the conventionality, the bread and butter operations of residentials, there's a variety of residential occupancies, both in terms of age and vintage and era in which they were built, that coupled with the varying degrees of fire severity, the urgency, and the growth potential, as well as the priorities of an incident and operations, there's a variety of different challenges affecting both the occupancy types, residential, and our commercials, which more often than not are our primary response areas. But yet we continue to see some of the challenges regarding commercial fire operations, where again, we're more or less set up for the day-to-day types of jobs and operations that we have for residential type occupancy responses, and the infrequency yet high risk factors that normally accompany various types of commercial fires. We are not either set up, or we may be challenged relative to changing our focal point, as well as the types of occupancy risks and associated hazards and operational demands associated with commercial fires. Distinctively two different types of operational parameters, yet we don't always have companies set up to deal with commercial type fires on a more consistent basis. We are typically set up to be operating at residential based structures or small footprint types of commercial or taxpayer structures, but not fully prepared to handle a very escalating, rapidly developing commercial fire, which has a different set of parameters, different set of standards of operation, and certainly a different set of demands, urgency, severity, risk associated with them. So we'll talk about some of those size of considerations as we move forward. The one thing that is common is that, again, we have an evolving built environment and a continuing demanding fire ground, which certainly challenges our operations each and every day as we stand prepared to go out into the street, ready to respond and deal with the types of operations that you have been dealing with in the past relative to your experience, your fire load, your operational load as such. But again, when we do show up in the street, are we operating in a fluid standpoint with a level of experience, with a level of appreciation and sensitivity to the types of occupancies that we have in front of us, coupled with the severity, urgency, and growth? Now, although we may have a residential structure, just as we saw here a moment ago with this particular slide, again, that particular building of a certain vintage, age, other performance-based factors certainly highly suggest certain tactical parameters, certainly give us a particular type of window of opportunity in terms of benchmarking, operations, and so forth, but it's certainly entirely different than what we look at here with this particular image of a fireground condition that very well may have a variety of different operational considerations, demands, urgency, growth, as well as resiliency, integrity, and time in terms of building performance. And you'll hear me talk more about resiliency, integrity, and time, both in the context of our residential structures and certainly when we talk about them in terms of our commercial buildings. It's all about understanding the building's resiliency, its integrity, and the time benchmarked windows that we have, our tactical windows of operation relative to working both within and surrounding that structure based upon incident priorities during the conduct of our fireground operations. When we take a look at our residential structures, we take a look at the types of fires that we involve, they certainly, again, may mirror to some degree our commercial structures, but commercial buildings and residential buildings, just in terms of construction, methodologies, materials, the types of footprint, reading the fireground, reading the building, reading the fire, and the level of resources that are necessary to fight fires in these distinctively different types of occupancies sets the stage relative to selected or identified or suggested tactical approaches, as well as command decision making and operational parameters that come about from them. Each one has a varying degree of resource needs, but again, those resource needs may start mirroring each other as we start approaching a certain footprint and size. In other words, you could certainly have a residential structure that has 20 or 30,000 square feet of occupiable or usage spaces within that occupancy that has almost a similar risk or a higher level of risk than a similar commercial building of 20,000 square footages. The distinctive difference between the two is that, again, there are a variety of different code and regulatory requirements that come into play within a commercial setting that may or may not be present within our residential settings. And more often than not, they are not present. We don't have the same level of rigor in terms of code requirements and standards and regulatory requirements for building integrity, resistance, resiliency that give us an operational time in each one of those two different types of structures. One very well may have passive or active protective systems in place relative to fire protection, apparatus and equipment and so forth, suppression systems, various types of barriers, isolated conditions in terms of fire area, fire zones, and so forth, where in fact we don't have that same level of robust defensive elements in our residential buildings. even coupled with the types of construction and materials that may be present, also are going to certainly influence your operational decision making, and certainly will influence the tactical windows of operation and the conduct of operations in the respective compartment and fire buildings. Certainly the severity and the magnitude of these fires will increase. We certainly see that more often than not in our commercial structures, certainly going forward from an initial alarm assignment to a full alarm box or multiple alarm all hands fires that quickly escalate into a larger type of demand relative to both operations resources and the commitment of those companies to operate in a long haul situation. But at the same time, we very well may see, as we've talked about, large scale, large area residential structures that very well may have similar types of demands. But the difference between the two, one has a degree of resiliency and resistance based upon the type of material that may be present, whereas the other typically does not. Residentials may have a hybrid level of construction. We certainly find more type 5 related construction versus type 1 or type 2 that may be present in our commercial type buildings. But all of these play out relative to what we end up dealing with when we talk about responding to a fire, whether it be residential, commercial, with the associated demands of our operations. And again, depending upon what types of frequency of conditions that we may have relative to those that are achievable, to those that are much more challenging, it all starts off and rests with the types of day-to-day operations that we are dealing with in terms of your experience, your runs, your risk level of your first due, mutual aid responses, the types of boxes that you respond to, and so forth. Truly, one of the equating aspects here is that building knowledge does equate to the tactical edge. The more we understand about our building construction, how that correlates back into the various types of occupancies and occupancy types, the greater the tactical edge will be regarding our operational capabilities. Our ability to size up our structures and taking a look at the various types of construction and materials and methodologies, the building's anatomy, the collapse and compromise potential, the kinds of construction and materials that may be present, occupancy usage, square footage, the volumes, the types of footprints the buildings may have, the numbers of floors and stories that it may have, how it's situated relative to that fireground in terms of reading the fireground, reading the building, reading the fire within that compartment, understanding the severity, urgency, and growth, then understanding the fire dynamics. There's 5 very specific correlated areas here that, again, when we take a look at our buildings, we have a greater heightened level of appreciation regarding our size up, reading the building, and our subsequent operations. Our operations also, when we talk about size up, are going to be influenced by the fireground arena of operations. And again, whether we are operating in a rural operational capacity, whether we may be operating in a suburban type of setting, or whether we may be operating in an urban type of setting. And even in the urban or rural settings, there's a variety of different types of conditions and relationships, all the way from seaside coastal to the mountains or the middle of nowhere, as we call them. So again, all of those will play out regarding benchmarking, tactical windows of operation, and more importantly, the severity and urgency of our fire conditions. Sometimes our operations on arrival very well may be dictated by our level of resources. Again, what side of our curve we are arriving on, whether we are a pre-flashover, a flashover, we're right on the bubble, or within a situation where we are arriving and beginning our operations in a post-flashover condition, all have major influence on the operations, the sizing up of our buildings in terms of what now is the severity, urgency, and growth relative to that. So we have to be much more cognizant and appreciative relative to the seriousness, the implications, the considerations, the aspects of risk, tactical engagement factors that must be accounted for regarding the first due in those operations. Goes without saying, don't engage like you've got a 5-person staff company when you only have 3. Again, some empirical information that's come out of both NIST and some of the other studies from UL over the past number of years. Again, there's a 20 to 30% differentiation when we take a look at operating between a 2 or 3-person staffed company, which again, relative to 4, 5, 3, 2, or limited staffing regarding the hostile types of environments. So just be aware that, and again, I think that many of you have that level of appreciation, just based upon the day-to-day types of staffing, the both the career, the volunteer, the combination type systems, the availability, the response times, deployment response, reflex times, all of these play out regarding operations. And again, what side of that curve you're on, whether you're on the bubble, which is the most precarious and hazardous of situations. But again, there's a whole different framing and standpoint when we size up our buildings in a post flashover standpoint relative to, again, building anatomy, collapse and compromise, occupancy risk, occupancy type, occupancy profiling, the methods and materials of construction, and the fire dynamics associated with that particular structure and building. Challenges and impacts, again, it's much more than stretching the line when we take a look at the types of conditions in terms of not just dealing with occupancy type, but the occupancy risk relative to its building characteristics, fire severity, and personnel resources that we may have. Also, just based upon where that building may be located, the siting, the conditions, the size, the magnitude of that building. Again, the building anatomy relative to its profiling, just in terms of its age and vintage and its footprint. How does that building relative to its footprint, both in terms of mass, in terms of square footage and volume, all play out relative to operational issues. And more often than not, it is just much more than just stretching the line. When we take a look at occupancy risk issues affecting our commercial buildings, and even with some of the things we've seen regarding our residential structures, the fire loading, fire load package, the severity levels that we are encountering within our occupancies, especially within our commercial buildings, as we see here in LA City, the fire severity certainly in this instance was not expected, but we can take a look at the level of intensity and the sheer level of impact on companies that are operating, trying to get off of the roof of the commercial structure that we see here. You also just take a look at the fire severity regarding the conditions on the rear division, the number 3 division of that particular structure. Again, all within the time frame of that first arriving sequence of events, particular duration of time, and how the situation goes from a bread and butter operation or things that we have a degree of either complacency or comfort in to something that suddenly completely changes the operations in such a dramatic and unexpected manner that we just are not prepared to deal with, which ultimately goes back to a number of key elements here regarding reading the building, understanding hazards, trying to identify some of the aspects dealing with fire dynamics, if they allow us, if those precursors and indicators are present, and how that plays out to our operations. When we look at all of them, certainly one of the key elements, it is all about stretching that line and getting in. It's all about the effectiveness of water application in either one of our occupancies. The common denominators for both residential and commercial, it's fast water, occupancy life safety, the tactical windows that are going to have to be consistent. Although one may give us a slightly longer tactical window of operational time just based on construction and materials, we have to be consistent regarding our operational periods in terms of that first arriving tactical window of a 10-minute window, a benchmark to determine progress, determine other factors regarding building resiliency, integrity, and time, and then to take a look at how we are conducting ourselves, what type of progress we're making, are there challenges regarding our operations, and then make adjustments if needed accordingly, or continue with the incident action plan that was put into place based upon the progress of companies that are operating and the feedback that's coming through. Again, it's building integrity issues that are first and foremost that will affect operational effectiveness and efficiency, as well as overall mitigation. Some of the things that we should certainly need to connect the dots on when we talk about structural firefighting, the relationship of learnings that are coming out of research, both NIOSH, the NFFF, U.S. Fire Administration, NFPA, UL, NIST, and so forth. Again, when we take a look at all of them, we're continuing to connect those dots, and they continue to influence the fundamentals of our operational domains and continue to influence much of what we write upon, as well as our research and modeling. Our model here that we're going to present toward the end of our session really focuses in much upon what we've gained, not only of recent in the last 15 years from the emerging research of UL and NIST, but really has been built upon research that has always been there, but has been neglected by the fire service. I mean, fire protection engineering studies, research have been going on certainly for well over 100+ years, but we have not been tuned up to recognize, nor have we been programmed to look at that information in the context of a suppression force versus an engineering side of it, and try to make some of these connections. Only of recent have we seen these connecting the dot opportunities with emerging research and trying to, again, move that ball forward regarding the operational domains and these functional areas of which we are moving forward in. So when we take a look at some of the aspects, and again, the only other thing, so that does influence when we talk about the aspects of our buildings on fire. It certainly influences much of what we discuss regarding the first arriving construction, tactics and safety of our buildings, of our occupancies. And again, it is a formative basis of our modeling approach. The dynamics, the information coming about, especially when we talk about the fire load packages within both related occupancies, residential and commercial, continues to trend along a consistent baseline. In other words, we are seeing almost similar types of fire load packages, heat release rates in some of our residential footprints and residential occupancies as we end up finding in our small footprint commercial buildings. There used to be a distinctive difference between the two in years past, back in the day. And again, as a result of typical fire loading in a residential occupancy versus commercial versus manufacturing and so forth, that distinction always had a basis based upon BTUs per square foot and the related gallon per minute flow rates that were necessary for fire suppression. Now we're seeing that that gap becoming closer and closer and more consistent. We're also seeing the fire dynamics and the kinds of conditions in the environment. I'll offer you this, although we don't get into it extensively in our program here today. We do talk about, in our integrated building construction and operational programs, the relationships of the aspects of the building, the compartment, and the company. And although we'll introduce that concept briefly as we get into our session here further, it's everything to do with understanding the building, reading the Fireground, reading the compartment, understanding the compartment's characteristics, the compartment's resiliency, integrity that, again, affect time in terms of operational periods and so forth, but then also the time in which that fire will potentially communicate and extend from a room and contents to a structure condition, how it may affect the building in terms of the building's integrity and over time, as well as the components within the building. So again, it's compartment fires affecting components and systems and assemblies, going beyond room and contents to the structure, and how that very well may affect overall building integrity during the conduct of operations, both within a particular floor or compartment, or around, underneath, or within the exterior of the structure. So a lot of engineering considerations go into the fundamentals of changing up the way we size up our buildings and looking at some of those factors that our model will present some information and insights on. Even in just in terms of understanding the dynamics regarding vent path, flow paths, the fire dynamics within the compartment, again, they are so critical as we read the fire, read the building, read the conditions within the compartment, and relate that back to other technology-based advances that help and drive improvements in fireground operations. The recent publication of the NFPA 1700 standard, the Guide for Structural Firefighting Strategy, Tactics, Task, supported by science-based research. If you've not had an opportunity to take a look at that particular standard, there are some tremendous insights that will, if nothing else, give you pause to reconsider how our operations are going to be conducted in the future. Another standard of note that really has a major play here in our session is the most recent edition of the NFPA 1710 standard. Again, many of you may be familiar with the initial fire attack flow rates of 300 gallons per minute, typically based upon 13 staffing with 2 lines flowing at least a minimum of 150 for each line. That has increased. There's another subset that is now in place, and this has applicability not only to large area residentials, but again, now has a connotation to the small footprint commercial structure. So again, 500 gallon per minute minimum flow rates for initial fire attack, dealing with a 13,000 to 19,600 square foot footprints, not so much volume, but square footages. now dealing with 3 lines versus the 2. So if you're not familiar with it, again, we don't have the opportunity to get into that in a greater degree of detail. Just be aware of the most current standard revision for 1710, and now the addition of the 500 gallon per minute flow rates for the 13K to 19.6K square foot footprints. Operationally, again, we've talked about building anatomy issues and understanding that there are differences in the occupancy types, the occupancy risk, as well as the methodologies and the construction that goes into the building's anatomy. I'll also offer you this, and we'll explain a little bit further in our session when we talk about era and vintage. The point in which a building may have been constructed, residential, commercial, those built in the 40s and 50s or 60s versus 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s and such, have a significant bearing on trying to identify era and vintage, then also having a level of appreciation based upon pre-incident knowledge, skills, and ability, learnings, understanding building anatomy, understanding construction, and the correlating principles that relate back to those 5 fundamentals. So it's building anatomy and the structural systems. It's understanding the occupancy type, occupancy risk, occupancy profiling. Going back to the building anatomy, it's also that era and vintage, when it was built within a relative time frame. The other aspect is the considerations and characteristics based upon collapse and compromise as we do our size up. The fourth item deals with the suggested or identifiable or predicted methods and materials of construction that went into the buildings, anatomy and systems that form the occupancy type and occupancy usage that are typically based upon era and vintage, and then the fire dynamics that come about relative to predictable characteristics based upon the building's profile, footprint, and other physical characteristics, both in terms of volume, size, cubic footage, square footages, and footprint, whether it be longitudinal, vertical, horizontal, and so forth. So we need to know that there's a distinction between those two and understand other elements. You can tell as we get into this, the size up of these buildings, the most critical element when we talk about size up relates back to understanding the building's characteristics, the predictability of the building's profile regarding construction, much more than just building type, but other building anatomy considerations that, again, our model is based upon, but it's just much more than what many of us have been programmed or conditioned to think about when we talk about size up. And we'll identify some size up considerations here and what they mean to us in a few moments. And again, when we take a look at the kinds of challenges, the facts and operational issues, first arriving construction, tactics and safety, from our residential to our commercial, the fire load, the megawatts of energy, the gallon per minute flow rates, even just in terms of the resource needs, the severity, the urgency of growth, where these incidences can quickly escalate from a tenant space, especially in our commercial buildings, from a single tenant space to involvement in multiple tenant occupancy spaces beyond the area of origin that further complexes, creates a complex, evolving and growing and escalating operation. At the same time, if we understand the building's anatomy, understand the characteristics in terms of the methods and materials of construction based upon age and vintage and other occupancy issues, as I mentioned, then we can go to work and conduct our operations accordingly if we have the knowledge, skills, and abilities. If we have the proficiencies that allow our companies to go into a tactical mode of operation and conduct themselves based upon the priorities and the identified incident parameters for the incident action plan, and go to work and do what needs to be done. Even in buildings and occupancies, when we take a look at our structures and we recognize there's certain features of the buildings that highly suggest a certain different type of tactical approach based upon a roof system or other potential risks or hazards, operations can still be conducted if there's a level of sensitivity, if there's a level of appreciation of how that building will perform under the fire dynamics, based upon its anatomy, based upon fire dynamics and severity within the compartment and within the voids. And again, that correlation of building, compartment, and companies. If the company's capabilities allow us to conduct those operations within a given tactical window of operations, then we can be doing some things that in other contexts, in other jurisdictions, in other parts of the country, it may be deemed high risk or may not be deemed an accepted practice of operations. And that's why we have conflicts, especially when we talk about operating on something like a bowstring truss roof or a barrel type roof. What is the actual construction? What are the configurations? Is it an East Coast, West Coast? There's just so many layers and parameters that the rhetoric that we constantly see, unfortunately, or we witness in our readings, especially online, that rhetoric will get someone killed. And that rhetoric, unfortunately, comes about through ignorance and comes about through inaccurate information that's being promoted by those that just have some insights from anecdotal information, some varying degree of experience, but really rely on anecdotal information just passed down. They just regurgitate it out, have opinions that really are not based upon factual evidence of either construction, architectural engineering, and continue to preach some things that, again, are positive or negative, but nonetheless may take us down paths that do not provide us with accurate building facts. We've witnessed some of the implications dealing with commercial fires in particular. And again, we talk about the Sofa Superstore fire from Charleston in South Carolina of June 18th, 2007. Again, routine call, life-altering events. If we just take a look at the building profile, the footprint, understand the fire loading, the fire severity, the urgency, how that building performs, and how it did perform under fire conditions within a given time frame, we certainly have the insights now. And I certainly encourage many of you who may not have read any of the reports, whether it be the NIST report, the NIOSH report, the after action Routley report that came out. I encourage you to visit that report, any one of those reports, and glean some information, especially when we talk about commercial firefighting and some of the aspects dealing with building performance. Just recognize those particular elements. When we put all this together, when we talk about reading the building, there are some influencing factors here that are pretty consistent. Those influencing factors include, again, the acronym of BEAR, dealing with the building, predictable performance, characteristics and considerations, the era and vintage in which the building was built, the building's anatomy, meaning the construction systems, assemblies, and components, and then the occupancy risk versus occupancy type of that structure. So it's important to identify the occupancy usage, but there's also going to be a related consideration dealing with occupancy risk. The 5 critical elements when we take a look at sizing upper buildings is identifying characteristics dealing with the roof, the perimeter walls, the floor systems, the compartment, understanding the compartment's configuration, size, other characteristics, and identifying the presence or absence of voids. So in any of these elements, there may either be a plus or a negative regarding those considerations. But when we take a look at our buildings, any buildings, but when we take a look at the predictability modeling, again, it's looking at the building's predictability, a criteria which is learned. There's a lot of other moving parts to that, but looking at its predictability performance based upon its anatomy, systems, the era and vintage, the building structural elements, and then the occupancy risk and occupancy type considerations. The next level of consideration when we take a look at our buildings also includes 5 key elements, and I've talked about this a couple of times here and reiterated it in the first few minutes of our conversation. The 5-star command model relates back to looking at buildings with 5 specific domains or functional areas. It's understanding the construction systems and the anatomy, occupancy type and risk, the collapse and compromise potential based upon the construction systems and anatomy. In other words, do I have material that's going to burn, or do I have material that's going to be subjected to varying elevated levels of heat impingement, and how will that affect building integrity, right, regarding resiliency, integrity, and time. So it's the methods and the materials, it's collapse and compromise considerations, because that first and foremost will affect our operations both within or surrounding the structure. And then it's the fire dynamics, having a greater degree of appreciation regarding the understanding of the fire within the compartment that relates back to the building's other characteristics that go from floor to roof to voids and so forth. The acronym of BEAR that we introduced, the resiliency, integrity, and time. So there's actually 2 factors when we're sizing up. It's understanding the resistance or resiliency, and they are distinctively different. So it's really 2 squared. Is the component, conditions, or features of the building, are they resistant to heat or flame? And if they are, they may have also a level of resilience. In other words, when they do become exposed, or that level of resistance may reach a failure point. Now we have exposure. Once we do have exposure, what kind of resiliency will that system or component have before some undesirable conditions occur that go back to compromise and collapse? Will the compromise be isolated or be catastrophic? Is it something that's going to occur over a chronic period of time, or is it going to be very acute? So it goes back to this level of integrity in terms of that building anatomy. Do we have resiliency? Do we have resistance? What is the degree of integrity? And the most critical operational consideration, we talk about our operational benchmarking period, certainly within that first 10 to 15 minutes, our window is always going to focus in on a 10-minute window, is do we have 10 minutes? Do we have the availability of time to conduct operations in or around that structure and that occupancy based upon those particular aspects? And ultimately, it ends up affecting it based upon severity, urgency, and growth. What are the priorities of the incident regarding occupancy demands, occupancy survivability? And by survivability, meaning, do we have individuals, do we have occupants that are in harm's way? And the longer it takes us to operate and conduct our operations, go into our primary, do our rescues and so forth, what is the severity? What is the urgency? What is the growth potential? And how will that affect the selection of tactics regarding our operations and resources? So it goes back to, again, building compartment and company capabilities, knowledge, skills, and abilities, their proficiencies or deficiencies, and how will that affect us based upon conducting operations either in a concurrent or a sequential standpoint. Do we have the ability to operate concurrently, or do operations and the priorities dictate us to operate in a sequential standpoint? So there's a lot of moving parts here, and it's much more than just showing up, doing a quick 360 and sizing up the building. There are different layers here that are built and programmed that give us our conditioned tactical response based upon our operations. When we talk about the compartment in either one of our occupancies, again, they will define our tactical operational considerations, the aspects of RIT, the rate of heat release, and again, fire suppression capabilities. When we talk about how that will play out in terms of our operations, time and engagement. So when we are sizing up our buildings, there are going to be these other layers that we are going to consider regarding engagement, regarding our availability of immediate availability of resources upon arrival, what's coming down the road, what do I have to call upon, do I have to strike another box, another alarm? Again, all of that will affect our safety, our risk, and the evolving nature of our operations that ultimately go back to gallon per minute flow rates. We talk about the compartment relative to the volume, the square footages, ceiling height, peak heat release rate, the megawatts of energy, fire growth rates, fire flow rates, as well as the flow and vent path considerations. It goes back to the considerations of our methods and materials and fire dynamics. These are certainly going to be impacted by those elements. Again, the aspects of bear, RIT, and severity, urgency, and then ultimately the degree of fire involvement. So we're just showing you for some further edification how these dots connect to each other, and they are part of the model when we size them up. So once we condition and develop the skill set level, some of these things become very innate. They are observable conditions if we know what it is that we need to be looking at and comprehending what it is that I'm seeing to be able to analyze, comprehend, analyze, and then make appropriate judgments that influence our decision making in that process. Again, we talk about today's Fireground. We see both in commercial and residential fire severity that is well beyond what was common to many of us back in a different decade and time frame. And we talk about back in the day, talk about old school firefighting for many of us that operated in the mid to late 70s, of which I am a student of that. I started in 1975. So fires back in the 70s and 80s, and much of what I had the opportunity to see firsthand within the area around College Park in Prince George's County, Montgomery County. Again, it's certainly very different than what we certainly are seeing today. Fire severity, what used to be just a nickel and dime can room and contents fire, quickly escalate and elevate from room and contents to structure fires. The severity level, even with efficient responses, is something that many of you have experienced firsthand. But again, just think about as we continue down that path, the longer it takes us to respond, we get to the scene, that fire severity is peaking in such a shorter tactical window that it does require a degree of engagement that is at the highest level of efficiency and proficiency that affects our operations. We take a look at, again, a very common small footprint type of commercial building, and it doesn't take much relative to Fireground time and operational that suddenly grows from a very achievable condition to something that is not only unmanageable, but has a level of risk that certainly may challenge what we normally expect to encounter. Here's a 100-foot aerial that just within a short period of time was had to be rebedded and had to be moved just based upon that fire growing beyond the capabilities of the operating engine companies that were fully deployed. I mean, there was a very robust degree of resources deployed on that first alarm. But again, we take a look at occupancy type, occupancy risk, fire loading, construction, materials, other factors here, and it doesn't take much to see how the fire severity will increase in magnitude in such a short period of time that may start affecting personnel as well as apparatus and other equipment around. Putting this all together very quickly in a couple of different moving parts here, we're talking about construction, air and vintage, fire compartment, and resources. That's the simplest version of our discussion thus far. When we relate that back to that 5-star modeling element, again, if we can just identify in the earliest stages construction systems, identify collapse and compromise considerations, characteristics, profiling, predictability, occupancy risk, methods and materials that went into that building's construction based upon the era, and have an appreciation of what's present upon arrival regarding fire dynamics. We put that together. Now we can start seeing that there's a direct correlation between these two. This becomes the formative elements of a more modernized perspective on size up and operations. The acronym of BEAR, building, era, vintage, anatomy, and risk, we've introduced that to you. Again, it really provides a different new fundamental connotations of operations. It's performance-based versus construction-based tactics. And again, for many of you, we are still operating construction-based tactics. We show up, we've got a type 1, type 2 building, we have a certain occupancy, and we go to work. It's much of what many of our tactical books and models have been built upon over certainly the last 30 to 40 years, but it's not keeping up with much of what we are now learning regarding fires, fire dynamics, and coupling that with building performance, especially with the kinds of materials going into our buildings currently, as well as the aging of our older structures. So we've actually differentiated and classified our buildings beyond just talking about them from a modern construction and legacy standpoint that many of you are familiar with when we talk about UL studies and they talk about modern construction, legacy construction. It goes well beyond that, but we'll leave that for another class and another discussion point in terms of era and vintage. For those of you that are interested in that, again, much of what we talk about is just based upon a specific or extended period of time. It connotates back to architectural engineering, construction factors that come about that all influence building performance and actually influence our decision-making on the Fireground. Predictability, performance, inherent, intrinsic, the adaptive, new, it's all based upon our standards and codes, so that's never going to go away. The era and vintage are defined by decades or period of construction. They relate back to architectural and engineering practices. They give us the measures and the bullet points of the predictability of performance. And again, it's another significant layering of some key areas that as I learned skill set defined by characteristics and it's related back to anatomy. So these are learned elements that one looks at to give us cues and indicators to identify, again, what we have, what we don't have, what we're predicting, what we're assessing or assuming on the Fireground, and being able to go to work. The anatomy features, we've talked about this a couple of times here going forward, but again, these are the 5 critical elements. If you walk away with nothing else today from our session and just start assessing your buildings based upon these 5 considerations, along with the considerations of the building's resiliency, integrity, and time, there's a couple of moving parts here, but that model will show you how that goes. If you can just start sizing up your buildings from that couple of bullet point standpoints, you will be so much further along in making that leap from size up, from an antiquated size up from the 40s and 50s vintage. And although we continue to utilize that in many of our methodologies, it's really making the leap forward in today's realm, and how that will certainly improve our operational capabilities going forward for tomorrow. Resiliency, integrity, and time, again, a very critical concept and methodology. It's part of a further developing risk matrix of probability based upon severity and probability consideration, just a different way to provide a level of consistency on how to not only identify risk, but also to communicate risk. So again, it's a game changer when we talk about changing a paradigm within the fire service of what is risk. Because I could ask any one of you that are listening to our session here today to describe risk. And again, if we had 100 of you out there and we were face-to-face, chances are we would have a variety, of a very significant variety of considerations of what risk is. And then when we try to quantify or qualify that, we further come about based upon how risk adverse or risk prone we are. And again, we can start seeing that there is a significant challenge in what risk is or what risk is not. The other aspect, when we just take a look at the graphic of looking at our 5-star command model, these domains, again, just a quick graphic that represents. The other thing here to note is that there's a relationship in this construction features of the aspects. We can look at construction systems and building anatomy and relate that back to fire dynamics, or construction and occupancy. Occupancy risk and type is further related back to compromise collapse. Compromise and collapse is directly associated with methods and materials, or again, these three. So these are the 5 correlating elements that we've identified, distilled based upon 30 plus years of experience, and really tying in what we've known and what I have personally witnessed by operating both as an architect and engineer and a fire officer, and bringing forward experience from all 3 professional domains, and connecting that dot with research that is again emerging and creating a consistency of things that we have always seen but have never been able to materialize in a model that we truly believe in. As we've been advocating for well over the last 15 to 20 years on a national level, there is a tremendous degree of merit in suggested areas to change our domain, change the way we do business in the street, while still being consistent with past methodologies and practices. We're certainly not suggesting that we throw out anything that the last 75 years of firefighting have given us. But again, we're looking at opportunities for improvement, just as we continue to improve in a variety of other methodologies and practices, and both in techniques and operations. The risk matrix, just very quickly, we'll introduce the risk matrix. This was introduced in 2012 as a result of a double line of duty death in Philadelphia. And again, there's some information online. If you take a look at the Philadelphia line of duty death with the York Street collapse and report, there's some further insights on the risk matrix that's been utilized a couple of times over in a number of other studies. It's been vetted by NIOSH and has been utilized as we've moved forward and conducted many of our studies when we talk about predictability, building performance, Fireground operations, especially when there's an adverse event, and especially when that event results in a undesirable situation, such as a line of duty death, near miss, or significant injuries. Again, if we can classify, if we know what it looks like, then we can train on it, we can condition ourselves, and we can put that together from an operational standpoint. Let me just jump ahead here for a moment. When we take a look at operational issues, again, ultimately goes back when we're sizing up our structures, resources, staffing, take a look at our command availability and capabilities, tactics or operations, the availability of time to conduct, the elapse of time that also has occurred, and the suggested adaptive fireground management modeling that one might have. Part of the challenge is that when we underestimate or have a degree of disengagement regarding fire behavior on the structure compartment stability, the aspects or the need for immediacy of actions, the need for effectiveness of actions, the fluid assessment and continuous monitoring of the building, the compartment, and the company, the impact on the occupants, the predictability of building performance, and again, time, task, intervention, and control. These are all continuing issues that are going to influence us. Either we underestimate or we get into a degree of disengagement upon our initial arrival, our assessment, and size them. When we take a look at some of the mission critical engagement items, there's an immediacy and robust, or there's a need for immediate and robust resources, effective and proficient staffing, concurrent tactical engagement, tactical mobility within our structures that sometimes is challenged when we take a look at large area residentials in particular, or cluttered or other related conditions in our residentials, or just in terms of the size and volume and the types of footprints that our commercial buildings may have. So tactical mobility, either on a plus or negative side, is going to be critical when we talk about operations. Command depth and resiliency, the time management of our operations, and the suggested use of an adaptive fireground management model, pre-planned building intel, the availability of it, or sometimes the absence of it. Do we have information that's readily available and accessible? And if we do have it, is it comprehensible? Do we understand what it is that we may have from that building intel, and how do we relate that back to the conditions of the building upon our observations and what we are gathering intel on based upon our 360 or communications on the fireground? So there's a lot of, again, moving parts here that all rely on other elements. At any point in time, there can be a short circuit or disruption that may affect overall operations. So when we take a look at those elements, and again, this is applicable to not only residential and commercials, this is a slide out of our large area residential and mega mansion class that we do. But again, it's consistent. When we take a look at, again, the building's configuration, the footprint of that building in terms of its siting, the conditions dealing with the severity and urgency of fire within the compartment, fire within the building, our availability of resources that we have, and again, what side of the curve we may be on upon our arrival. It's understanding the aspects of severity, urgency, and growth in terms of our engagement and operations once we start getting into the building, and sometimes our challenges regarding that, our tactical benchmark and windows, and then the effective sustainability of critical fire flows. And it goes back to some simple elements here, but sometimes the most critical piece here is that we've got things working together and they're hitting on all cylinders, but we don't have critical fire flow. We don't have sustainability, gallon per minute flow rates. It is so critical when we talk about large area residentials or mega mansions, especially when we start getting in the 15 to 20,000 square foot single family residentials, but it's also going to be critical in that 20,000 square foot plus commercial buildings. And that becomes a tipping point. Again, do we have protected systems in there? Do we have a certain type of commodity? Do we have a certain level of fire intensity based upon fire load, occupancy usage, and so forth? Just in terms of the footprint and the volumes of our commercial buildings, coupled sometimes with the hybrid types of construction and materials, the methodologies that went into the building based upon era and vintage. All of these create a perfect storm where we are showing up, we're stretching that 1 3/4 line or maybe a 2-inch line, when in fact that operation requires multiple 2.5-inch hand lines deployed within the shortest time frame, where we can't even do that because we don't have the availability of resources, or if we do have the resources, we don't have the knowledge, skills, and efficiencies for those companies to deploy, get that water in the appropriate location based on tactical mobility, and start flowing before the fire intensity grows beyond the point in which we are able to extinguish, and we are just merely working that condition without truly extinguishing the fire. We still have severity, intensity, and growth that now starts doing what? It's affecting the structural integrity and compromise of that building. And suddenly we start seeing these dominoes that start falling by the wayside regarding our operations. We put all these together, just a quick snapshot. It just talks about how these are so important in terms of our operation. Tactical windows, the items that we've mentioned thus far, gets back into a tactical edge of response, but ultimately has this influence on all of those particular features and conditions. All right, let's see where we're at here on our time window. All right. Let's talk about some of our overview, and we're going to sort of jump ahead a little bit just based upon the elapsed time that has occurred. When we take a look at some of the predictable elements, we take just, again, that are predictable that one has to consider in sizing up our structures. When we take a look at modern construction systems, Again, mixed construction systems are going to be the norm. Engineered methods and materials, the complexity of the structures, fire behavioral impacts, time limiting conditions, tactical changes that are going to affect and certainly highly impact. It's highly suggested that they very well may impact the rules of engagements that we have relative to our SOPs, SOGs, and our consistent way of doing business in the past. We take a look at the effect of architectural engineering, green building, carbon footprinting, and the flow of money that influences just about everything. Again, rapid changes in technology and implementation, performance-based codes and testing, rules of engagements are not known. The demand for adaptive versus prescriptive modeling is highly suggested, which is really the premise of much of what we're talking about here today. Cost and consumer-driven changes that are occurring, new and reutilization of our old buildings. So again, we take a look at older commercial structures that continue to evolve over their life cycle. We have old buildings that continue to evolve into new buildings. So again, the importance of understanding the hybrid types of structures that one has to pick up upon arrival. So you have that old commercial building as part of downtown Main Street or a standalone building. What's unique? What's changed? What's changed about that building that was built in the 60s or 70s as it currently exists, and the occupancy usage that it may have today? It may have changed occupancy usages 10, 15 times over the last 20 or 30 years. Sometimes it changes every 6 months just based upon other challenges in there. So again, those are going to impact building integrity issues and certainly highly influence operational standpoints. So the scale, the size, the shape, the volume, and the square footage is when we take a look at those particular considerations. The fire behavior and fire load packages, fire behavior impacts based upon the anatomy, time limiting and time compression, tactical changes, again, affecting the rules of engagement, fire flow demands, fire resource demands. Again, the challenges is underestimating or having a risk of aversion, because it's all about what? Stretching the line going in, but yet we're not truly sizing up and looking at some of those factors that should influence our decision making. We are merely going into a automatic mode of operation, autopilot, and complacency creep sometimes comes into play that ends up affecting us. Fire flows, underestimating, again, risk aversion, actual flow demands versus perceived flow demands, time limiting, time compression. You see that there's a consistency there. Tactical changes to our rules of engagement, and again, fire resource demands and complacency. Collapse and compromise, age, deterioration, alterations and modifications, structural systems, especially when we have mixed, especially when we have engineered structural systems, old and new methods and materials, inherent collapse and compromise characteristics, which again have to be learned to be able to understand what it is that we're going to be picking up upon. The lack of collapse zone management critically is one of the deficiencies out there. The lack of knowledge, skills, and abilities on building construction or building anatomy, that goes without saying. And I would challenge any of you out there, do you have the adequacy of building knowledge to be able to plug that into the size up, or do we merely arrive on scene and go into our condition tactical reflex mode where we've got a single family residential type 5 construction, fire on the number 2 floor, and we're going to work. We suddenly, we communicate what it is we're doing, or we don't even communicate much anymore. We just show up, hit a couple of buttons on the computer panel, and then go to work. Again, we sometimes have this loss of communication skills that becomes so critical. What do I have showing? What am I predicting? What am I anticipating? What is suggested by my arrival? And where will that condition be upon my deployment into the building within the next 30 to 40 seconds, the next minute and a half, let's say the next 60 to 90 to 120 seconds? Where will things be? It's dynamic versus static. So again, it gets back into command compression, complacency, and other creeps. We talk about some of the occupancies: wood frame, type 5, single family, multiple occupancies, old or urban. Again, occupancy usage, the status, age, deterioration, alterations, the modifications, fire behavior extension, occupancy load, traditional, traditional fire suppression modeling, and fire flows. More often than not, we can still operate efficiently and still put these fires out. It's when we start getting into the larger square footage buildings in both instances. But again, we have the ability to recover to some degree in our residential, but it all depends on, again, fire behavior and the structural systems versus commercial. But in our commercial buildings, we have a higher degree of susceptibility relative to RIT in terms of resiliency, integrity, and time that may cause some collapse, compromising, or fire behavior conditions in the compartments now because of what? Square footages and volume. So again, we are giving up something in one and the other, but it all goes hand in hand. It all ultimately goes back to fire flow conditions and characteristics and fire behavior. We talk about old occupancies, age, vintage, traditional fire suppression modeling will always work. Size, complexity of our buildings, just again, having appreciation. We could have a different, so let's talk about occupancy risk. So let's say I've got, we're taking a look at this bottom slide here. Let's say I've got a 4,000 square foot single family residential built in the 1930s. How is that different from a 4,000 square foot single family residential built in 2010? Again, just in terms of size, complexity, the size may be similar relative to a footprint or square footages, but again, when we talk about risk factors, we don't have the same type of configuration of closed compartments. We don't have the same type of usage of materials. We have different susceptibility. We have different flow conditions relative to fire extension. We have different types of voids. All of these in terms of compartment, size, volume, connectivity, methods of material affect fire behavior and have different flow demands. One will give us a different operational time, which more often than not will give us the operational periods. When I talk about new engineered structural systems in a 2010 single family residential of 4,000 square feet, that tactical window is going to be much more narrower. And again, it's going to demand an operational execution within a much shorter time frame. Newer single family residentials, again, era, vintage, size, complexity, occupancy, load, methods, and materials, again, they're going to be dramatically different, that are going to decrease the operational window period. And that's going to be even true when we talk about large area residentials. Again, these aspects, tactical resources, fire behavior, flow demands, these are all going to increase, and you're going to really require almost a gallon per minute flow rates of critical sustainable flows on a comparable level as you would in a large area commercial size building. Our taxpayers, again, construction systems, what kind of systems based upon era and vintage, age, deterioration, the alterations, methodologies, the changes of structural modifications that affect stability, structural stability, and then looking at fire load packages and fire flow demands associated with those operations. We've talked about occupancy risks. Actually, let's go back. So there are building risks that we're starting to identify with. There are occupancy risks, and there's also at-risk behavior. So it goes back to, let's go back again here just real quickly. So when we take a look at our buildings, again, our buildings regarding building risks, inherent items that we've discussed thus far. We take a look at the occupancy types, residential to commercial. There are going to be occupancy related risks. And then certainly when we talk about at-risk behavior, it's the human performance element in terms of our companies. However significant or few we may have regarding those capabilities and limitations, it's either a plus or a negative. The availability immediately upon arrival, the availability as we continue in our operations, the availability based upon a greater alarm assignment, tactical box, and so forth. It all ultimately goes back to, again, that core of operations. It's reading the Fireground, reading the building. It's reading smoke in the compartment, reading or reading the fire behavior. But for many of us, again, reading smoke has become a consistent and an accepted practice. But again, there's four distinctive areas that we're looking at in terms of that core: reading the Fireground, reading the building, reading smoke, and then reading your company. So our discussion here in this session is really sort of touching upon all of these elements. Normally when we talk about size up, yeah, we're reading the building to some degree, we're reading smoke and conditions that are either evident or predicted based upon our arrival, and trying to put that all together. In a simple world back in the day, it used to be reading smoke, reading fire. We either had something visible on arrival that indicated a fire severity or urgency and a potential growth. We identified some very simple building construction features of the building, an occupancy usage, an occupancy type, and then normally a couple of other bullets regarding our quick size up when we went to work. It was construction-based tactics at its best, and that's what really allowed us just to go to work, stretch the line, and more often than not have successful outcomes. It has become more complex only because our buildings continue to become more complex, and the fire dynamics within our buildings, within our compartments, demands of us to have a much more critical assessment degree of criteria that we've got to develop the skill set on, to not lose time on the Fireground to conduct our size up, but to become more efficient and more effective in assessing our buildings, doing those reads, and seeing what might influence our decision making. It's so imperative to connect our observations, our predictions, our building intel, and then put that into our decision-making process effectively based upon the influence of those parameters. And that's the key element here to moving forward in our current time and place of 2021 going forward, how to become more effective on today's emerging and demanding Fireground, utilizing tactical patience, and then lastly, just tactical fire engagement. And again, that gets into a couple of other elements. We introduced, again, these considerations on the compartment, the company. And again, these are critical, and we put them together regarding those elements just from building, compartment, and company standpoint. And they become the core to our operations. We talked about tactical windows. That first arriving, it's a tactical window of a 10-minute period. Some of you may be operating with a 20-minute window, 15-minute window, 10-minute. And for those of you that are operating with anything less, I'm not even quite sure how you're able to operate without those. They all will ultimately affect decision-making points in terms of our conditions and operations. Also end up having an influence on demands, associated risks, and the actions that are taken. So again, when we take a look at tactical windows, what is a tactical window that our SOP, SOGs dictate? Do you have one? Do you not have one? It's interesting when we take a look at best practices around the country, in other states, other jurisdictions, it varies. There's some that have none. There are many that continue to use a very antiquated 20-minute window. Others have a 15-minute window that's again rooted and stuck back in the 80s. Some are up to date with best practices of a 10-minute window and what that means. There's a lot of elements that relative to that 10-minute window that have to be considered. It's just a check and adjust as part of our benchmark and is not part of what we call PAR. So benchmarking, tactical windows, and PAR are distinctively different. They are also different from our canned progress reports and programs and so forth. So again, just be aware that there are differentiations between any one of those areas. These elements have, again, are time determinant, they're optimized, they relate back to building occupancy risk, fire severity, the priorities based upon, again, life safety in particular of civilians that may be in distress or may be in harm's way. And again, it goes back to the capability of our skill-based resources in our companies. Building compartment stability, fire behavior, and fire dynamics are considerations that one has to assess relative to our size up. And again, our size up factors, we've heard the 360, the 180. We talk about just building intel, pre-incident information. We talk about just getting up on the roof, getting from front of the building to the rear of the building and looking out that back window just to identify what's in the alleyway, what's in the rear of the building. Sometimes we have the availability of doing a 360s. In other instances, there's going to be a time consumingness associated with trying to do a 360 around a 20 or 30,000 square foot footprint of the building. What happens if the building is rather long, has more longitudinal versus the depth? Yeah, we can get around the side of the building relatively quick, but now I've got to access a relatively long span in terms of distance on a commercial structure, or even in a residential, large area residential, 15, 20,000 or plus square footages. Now I'm talking about topography and terrain considerations, the time of year. Do we have snow? Do we have ice? Do we have vegetation? Do we have landscaping? Do we have a variety of other impediments that might, again, restrict or create a time-consuming measure to get around the building? Can I pull up something on my Google Maps on my smartphone? Can I throw up the drone real quick and get some information? There's a variety of things that can be utilized. It's just a matter of how they are tied into your operations, your SOPs. Are you leveraging and utilizing and embracing technology, or are we relying on an antiquated way of doing business? And there's a variety of different variations that all come into play. All of these, again, are going to be influenced by incident severity, urgency, and growth. And obviously, as I'm talking about, they are affected by time and affected by resources. And again, resiliency goes back to the building as well as our own physical resiliency. Resiliency, integrity, time factors, and operations. we normally have lots of ideas at the task levels, got to do something, and that's what sometimes dictates what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Again, the building fire will influence or define our operational perspectives. We just throw everything out because of the severity, the priority of what we've got to do. We stretch the line. We sometimes go in and do what has to be done. But again, they will influence our operation and certainly impact some of our operational considerations. Let me just sort of see where we're at. First do ops. We sew up. Again, we've talked about severity, urgency, building considerations and profiles. The larger the building, commercial, residential, the more significant the urgency may be in terms of differentiation, but also in terms of the potential for building compromise collapse and the urgency for actions that have to take place in a timely fashion. When we take a look at those considerations and factors, they all will affect us when we talk about severity of our buildings. And that severity ends up going back to our operational characteristics in terms of those demands and conditions. Hold on a second, let me recue this. Those operational considerations, again, don't treat conventional residential fires like we would. So as we see an escalating size of our building, commercial, residential, from a small footprint, small volume to a larger type structures, again, do not think about conventional tactics being utilized. It does require a more adaptive approach, and the rules of engagement that we typically have had certainly very likely, or it's highly suggested, may not work when we talk about those operations. We will have an increasing level of risk, and those levels of risk, again, are going to be related back to resource dependent in terms of knowledge, skills, and abilities, time dependent in terms of high human performance, thinking capabilities, performance, building performance, fire behavioral issues, the compartment, the voids, and water flow characteristics. So this is common to both related conditions in our size up and our operations. Some of the factors on size up, and again, when we size up our building, what have we typically been utilizing? Do we have a protocol? Do we follow a cookbook perspective and approach? Are we sometimes working out of the box and out of the lines? Or are we so structured and regimented that, again, we suddenly go through a robotic reciting of the check the box approaches? So again, how are we assessing it? Have we trained? Do we have dynamics that come into play? How are we able to get past challenging conditions based upon things that are either observable or have to be predicted? And if we are predicting, is there a degree of reluctance based upon what is it that we don't know and are assuming based upon known factors and also based upon experience levels in the past? So there are qualitative and quantitative processes. How do they fit into your world? What are you utilizing? How have they been measured in the past? What type of levels of quality? Do we have dynamic types of training and skill set development? Or has it become one of those things that's expected to be done on the job that we gain through experience on the job, but we aren't doing things much different than the day we showed up on the job, however recent or however long ago it may have been in the past? We talked about defining risk in terms of both quality and measures. We've provided some information on that. Many of you are familiar with Brunacini's risk-a-lot doctrine that was developed back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. But again, the aspects of the rules of engagement from the IFC, the 2001 version, the Everyone Goes Home program, the new rules of engagement that was published in 2010, 11 years ago, which again gave us some considerations of rules of engagement and considerations for size, both from the firefighter, fire officer, and command standpoint. But again, there's a variety of processes, methodologies, training skill sets, and fill in the gaps that all have to come together. It's a fluid process. and understand that, again, there are key benchmarks. There's going to be the company officer size up. There's going to be command size up. There's going to be the transfer of command potential size up that one has to consider in terms of assessing. There are going to be key benchmarks that are going to be time influenced and dependent during the conduct and course of operations. They're integrated based upon discipline and functional attributes. And again, things that are fed, influenced, they have an effect that's either singular or collective, and again, are going to be part of Fireground management and task level operations. There are no clear holistic models out there. Many of our current models and methodologies, it would be safe to say, are antiquated at best. But again, much of what we've learned and the kinds of skill development are consistent with what we have available to us in our readings, our methodologies, and our practices. But it's much more than just a 3-story brick with fire in the number 2 with civilians in distress, and we're stretching in. It gets into much more than that. Information availability, again, do we have pre-incident information? What kind of availability, familiarity might we have with the incident location, calls, alarms, kitchen table discussions, expertise, building intelligence while en route, on-scene reports, recon and assessments, kinds of information that one can delegate or get firsthand or delegate it out. Again, learnings and training that come about, our walkthroughs, our inspections, the stuff that we're going to gain off duty, and the kinds of things that we're going to research on our own. These are all part of the assessment and size up considerations, both on scene and off scene. Some of you may be familiar, again, when we talk about the classical size up, Lloyd Layman size up, really is still formative today. Rescue, resources, confinement, extinguish, overhaul, ventilation, and salvage. The 5-step process that Lloyd Layman gave us. So the previous version from 1950, Lloyd Layman refined that. It continues to be an influence today, and certainly influenced one of the other up and coming size of considerations here that I'll talk about. But in 53, Lloyd Layman started really giving us what we consistently have had over the last 20 to 30 years currently in the modern era: facts, probability, own situation, decision-making, plan of operations, and going to work. Emmanuel Freed in 72 gave us size up of life safety, time, a fire, height of the building. So this was the first introduction in 1972 of some of the considerations of building characteristics: building construction, building area, occupancy, fire load, fire location, extent, exposures, water supply, weather, and resources. So it wasn't until John Norman in his classical Coal was Wealth did we start really developing this into what has become a standard. And that standard has been built upon some things that existed and still are influenced from 72, 53, and 50. But it has become much more than that when we talk about today's operations. Sizing up, even though the blue card system is sizing up, structure size up, building size up, occupancy type, name, fire conditions, initial tactical tasks. Again, some of these are static, some of these are dynamic, but ultimately they all go back to the elements that we just talked about: the BEAR concept, the 5-star command, looking at building anatomy, again, occupancy, risk, compromise, characteristics, collapse, compromising conditions, identifying the methods and materials of construction based upon the era and vintage, and then the fire dynamics. So those are the elements relative to resilience, integrity, and time, severity, urgency, and growth. Those are the considerations that one starts putting into our modeled standpoint and perspective. Mission critical, that pre-incident information, reflex time considerations, response en route, arrival. Again, what are we identifying upon our arrival? Reading the Fireground, looking at the building or 360, 180. And again, the other attributes and factors that waterfall out of the series of bullets that one would look at for reading the building. Understanding and reading the compartment, fire, reading the fire. The company level, tactical edge, reading the company. So now you can start seeing that there's a correlation of building, compartment, and company during the initial conduct of our operations. Officer leadership, discipline, experience, knowledge, the fortitude, the level of rigor, the department resources, training, SOPs, SOGs, and methodologies, company mission, clarity, tactical edge of operation. And then certainly at the personnel level, we talk about individual knowledge, skills, experience, direction, stamina, resiliency, and grit. And then the same thing, the mutual aid capabilities, competency, cohabitive timeliness of operations and conditions. When we size up our buildings, the broad-based perspective is considerations for our arrival. We talked a little bit about building facts, talk about first arriving, identifying construction, tactics, and safety. Take a look at building performance, compartment, and company. And then the relationship of those 5 critical building reads of construction systems, occupancy risk, collapse and compromise, methods and materials, and fire dynamics. We start putting those together relative to the compartment and the fire conditions that we may have. The other element, although we didn't talk about the additional bullets that include behavior, growth, propagation, severity, and connectivity, they all give us and actually influence. So our fire dynamics will influence the considerations regarding RIT, resiliency, integrity, and time. When we put these together, this gives us an impact on performance-based tactics, of which we are, as a fire service, is moving towards and moving towards in some fashion. The takeaway from our session here is that if we take a look at and start putting together features of construction, tactics, and safety regarding our building features, understanding those elements regarding the occupancy types and usages, the anatomy, the dynamics, they will start giving us a model approach. That model is what we have here. And again, it's just a very high level perspective. There's some moving parts here that we don't have the availability of time to get into in our session, but hopefully you'll have a degree of appreciation of some of the things that we've given you. These are all correlated. They give us a holistic approach, and they are able to be plugged into any type of building type. So we talk about the residential, that typical Cape Cod of 1,500 square feet, the conventional type of residential of 15 to 3 or 4,000 square feet, the large area residential from between 4 to 6 to 8,000 square foot. We start getting into our mansions between 11 and 15,000 square foot. And then now we start getting into our mega mansions, our giga mansions, and our tetra mansions. And if you've never heard me use those terms before, I would encourage you to go to a couple of our podcasts, especially on our mega mansions. We explain them in greater detail. We also do a separate program on mega mansion firefighting and operations, and get into the definitions and specifics, both in terms of size up, considerations, and operational perspectives. So there is no simple silver bullet to take a look at all of them. However, there is a roadmap in assessing and identifying. So if I look at just identifying dynamics, building anatomy, taking a look at some of the features here that we've related back to, as we talked about here again a moment ago, this becomes the most basic of the approaches. The model gives us and highly suggests a variety of parameters to start looking at our residentials and commercials, which are part of our typical day in and day out responses. And that is inclusive of single family residential, as well as our multiple occupancies in our small footprint commercial buildings, typically 25,000 square foot or less. Because again, when we start getting beyond the 25,000 square foot and we've got sizable fire severity, urgency, and growth potential, it's pretty straightforward. We have what we have. We typically end up going to multiple alarm fire conditions, and we distinctively treat those fires differently than we do others that are much more manageable upon our initial arrival. Because again, there's a degree of complacency or comfort based upon similar experiences that we've had in being able to achieve mitigation in a sizable fire that, based upon the parameters of that building, of the compartment, allow us to go to work within a tactical window and still achieve a success in mitigation. 25,000 square foot or higher, operability of fixed or active or passive fire protection systems may or may not be present. But again, building characteristics, again, compromise, collapse, the application of fire dynamics regarding RIT, those influencing factors there, these all start coming to play, which either help us or more often than not deter us and work against us in the successful mitigation or safe mitigation or risk managed situation of operations within those effective structures. So when we put that together, they do give us a predictability performance. That predictability of performance, again, is performance-based tactics. And then performance-based tactics, when we take a look at it from an operational standpoint, is really the basis of an adaptive fireground management model, of which our size up, our assessment, our building reads come about. And it also is based on local or regional conditions. It's selecting and implementing the best proven or predictable tactics that work best in your system. So in other words, don't believe a word about anything that somebody's coming in and saying, look, here's this best model that's out there, and it's all based upon these particular line of tactics. Well, tactics are all going to be based upon local or regional based parameters that are all driven by either consistency at the state, regional, or local level of the department or jurisdiction. So if you have consistencies at the state level, which we do in the state of Maryland, again, you're going to see consistencies in SOPs, SOGs, methodologies, and practices from county to county, region to region. It's other parts of the country that don't have consistencies and have a high degree of variation, sometimes just literally across a few blocks away from department to department. You're not going to see the same type of elements here. So again, the selection of best proven tactics and predictability based upon the systems approach. And that again gives us, and should influence, strategic management and direct tactical fire engagement. Quickly, a couple of things I just want to hit upon that you should take a look at. I had the opportunity to work on a couple of different reports. One significant report that will give you some very good lessons and learnings that start wrapping together our takeaways here in commercial firefighting. The NIOSH report of F 2013-14 occurred on May 3rd of 2013. Line of duty death of a 29-year career firefighter while conducting operations in a strip mall. So much of what we just touched upon is going to be present within the aspects of this report. Significantly, when we take a look at some of the details out of this report, especially when we talk about commercial fires, standalone strip malls, I mean, there's just a wealth of information that we are limited by the availability of time in this particular session to get into. But when we get into the level of detail here, we did have the opportunity in this report to really expand upon a variety of different considerations dealing with both construction. Excuse me here. Hold on, so we just jumped out of sequence of our slides. Some of the considerations, both based upon construction, the other related aspects and features that are common to commercial type buildings. Much of what we wrote about getting into type 2 construction and classifications, considerations, fire dynamics, building performance. Again, there's a wealth of information here that one will find very useful to collectively give us a culmination on building performance, operations, and characteristics. Another report that, again, based upon commercial firefighting in particular, was the line of duty death of a firefighter in San Antonio. And again, Scott Deem's lessons learning. The NIOSH report is F 2017-14. It was issued in 2018. Again, significance when we talk about a preventable line of duty death, training, freelancing, culture, accountability, training issues, risk issues, command issues, building, and personal protection issues. This was a 1981 vintage shopping strip mall type of setting. And again, I would encourage you to take a look at not only the NIOSH report, but also the state of the Fire Marshal's report from the state of Texas that will give you some further insights. And then lastly, the one report that I'm sure many of you have read or are familiar with to some degree, and that was the most recent, at least departmental after action report. And that was the line of duty death investigative report in Howard County for Lieutenant Nathan Flynn, again, dealing with a large area residential or mansion type setting. I can't stress enough about the value of what came about as a result of the commitment by all parties within Howard County Fire and Rescue that put out an exceptional report for lessons, learnings, and insights. So again, there are a number of reports out there. The Prince Williams County line of duty death report from Kyle Wilson's another report, the Coleraine Township report from Ohio from a double line of duty death For those of you that are interested, if you want a listing of some key reports, both on the commercial and residential, that I feel are significant for reading lists at the company and command level or any level of rank, just send me an email. I'll get you that information out. But certainly just a couple of key takeaways here to provide some insights for those related conditions. Other than that, we'll just sort of end it as we really approach our time frame here. Pretty much everything we've talked about revolves around critical thinking. There's a lot to be said about all of that. There is no wrong way. Really hope we've provided you with a few bullets and some takeaways here on a very broad-based area that certainly requires a much greater degree of time to delve into each one of the topical areas. But our focal point was really providing some insights on the model and the perspective, the 5-star command, the BEAR concepts. A couple of key elements here. If you're looking for some more information on some specifics on those, there are some reports out there that we worked upon, and actually another line of duty death report, Southwest in Fire. I forgot to make mention of that. NIOSH report F 2013-16, small commercial building fire, 5 line of duty deaths, 4 on scene, and a 5th subsequent line of duty death that occurred with the captain who survived the fire. That was in Houston, Texas of May 31st, 2013. All of these reports that I made reference will have a much greater degree of the depth in detailing some bullets, some significant takeaways on construction, operational considerations, and size of considerations. So I encourage you to take a look at those reports and gain some further insights. Again, I certainly want to thank the board, all of the officers and executives from the association for allowing me to be part of your virtual conference. We certainly do look forward to the opportunity to see each other face-to-face in 2022 at the conference, and hopefully be able to get into a much more robust, detailed level of conversation in a face-to-face setting. Phone call, email away. Certainly look forward to helping any of you that might be seeking out some further information. I certainly hope you enjoyed and gained some insights out of this session and continue to gain some additional insights out of the fabulous, insightful programs that the conference committee has put forward here for your 2021 virtual convention and conference in terms of the educational opportunity. So again, thanks, my appreciation to the association, and for all of you out there, stay safe. We'll see you next time around. Take care, everybody.